Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, August 8th, 2024. This year, on Tisha B'Av, this coming Monday night and Tuesday, we have the duty to mourn and grieve the tragedies of 2,000 years ago. The suburban, the destruction of the Second Temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and the first Beit HaMikdash. The burning and destruction of Yerushalayim. The exile of the Jewish people. The distancing from God that results from all of that. And many other catastrophic events that occurred on this date. And without diminishing that, we are currently in mourning for the tragedies of October 7th and every day since. And it is proper that today's events are folded into our commemoration of Tisha B'Av. Rashi, the famous medieval commentator, writes, but Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, when we're remembering the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, mazkirin kinos al ha'harugim b'gzeros she'iro b'yameinu. We add mourning for other tragedies that have occurred in our history, not necessarily on this date. But Tisha B'Av becomes a collective of all of these different tragedies. There are two paths that I want to share with you this evening to experiencing this pain and loss and the hope for comfort and consolation. One path is to see in the traditional Kinnot. The Kinnot are the poems of lamentation. We recite some of them on Monday night and many more of them on Tuesday morning. It is one of the main ways that we express our sadness through these complicated but very beautiful, poignant poems. And it is eerie to see how applicable these poems, written, some of them 1,600 years ago, how applicable they are to October 7th, how clearly these ancient poems encompass and express what we are going through today. And the other path, as after past tragedies, like the Crusades and the Holocaust, is that there are writers today writing new expressions of sadness and mourning and hope, written specifically for this moment. I will share with you tonight just a small amount of what I have gathered, and I want to express my gratitude to Tzohar, the rabbinic organization in Israel that is such a wonderful organization, to the RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, to the OU, and to several other individuals for sharing the material that I will share with you tonight. On Monday night, after reading Eicha, the book of Lamentations, we say 5 Kinos, 5 of these poems. And the fourth of the 5 was written by Rabbi Shlomo ben Gavriel. He lived in Spain in the 11th century. And he mourns in this poem the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. You know, of course, that during the First Temple period, there was a separation of Israel into 2 distinct kingdoms. The north, also known as Shomron, and the south, which encompassed Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, also known as Yehuda. And they are depicted in this poem by the names of two sisters. Ohala is the name that represents the 10 tribes in the north, and Oholiva, the name that is used for the tribes of Judah in the south. Shomron kol titein mitzauni avonai. Shomron, the northern part of Israel, depicted as Ohala, says, my sins have caught up with me. Le'eretz acheretz yitzauni vonai. My children have left me for another land. When Sancheriv came to conquer the northern kingdom, he exiled the 10 tribes of the north, and they were permanently lost from the Jewish people. And so, Ohala, the representation of the northern kingdom, mourns for her children who have disappeared. Va'aliva tizak nisrafu armonai. But Ahaliva, representing Jerusalem, she screams in response, my palaces are in flames. Vatomer Tzion azavani Hashem. God has forsaken me. Jerusalem was burned. Lo lach Ahaliva. Ola says to her sister Ahaliva, no. Chashovan yeh kanye. You can't compare your suffering to my suffering. Hasamshili shivrech l'shivri v'l'chalii. Do you think you compare your downfall to my collapse? Chamuras ahivshit v'hitziles edyi. The enemy stripped me bare of my treasures and jewels. Ulachlach v'chavar nasa es avshivyi. And carried off my captives to foreign lands. Domi ahaliva v'al tivki b'ki. Sh'nosayach archu v'lo archa yamai. Ahaliva, don't complain, because your kingdom lasted much longer. The northern kingdom was conquered and exiled more than 100 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. So she says to her sister, don't complain, Jerusalem. Your kingdom lasted much longer. V'ahaliva tizak. But Ahaliva screams in response, Nisrafu armonai. My palaces are in flames. Vatomer Tzion azavani Hashem. God has forsaken me. A competition of pain. Whose is worse? Who's grieving more? Arguing. Which is the greater tragedy? I want to share with you a story from my friend, my colleague, someone from whom I learned so much, Rabbi Ruvain Tradberks. He used to be a rabbi in Toronto, and he lives in Israel. There was a gather early on in the war for bereaved parents, coordinated by generous and kind-hearted folk. There were parents of fallen soldiers, parents of those murdered at the Nova Festival, and parents of those murdered in the kibbutzim around Gaza. The parents attended with such trepidation because, you understand, it's several different groups. They're all mourning their children, Nebuch, God forbid, but there are differences. What will happen there? Who will be there? People shared their stories in a large circle. The parents of soldiers who had fallen shared their pain and their pride. The parents of the Nova victims shared their pain. Some of the parents of soldiers expressed discomfort. Our children died heroically. Yours were at a party. This gathering did not help, it hurt. The competition of pain. Whose pain is worse? And there are so many pains today. Pain over the hostages, the families of the hostages, the wounded, their family, the fallen and their families, the traumatized. There is a competition of grief, and we cannot evaluate which is the worst, because they are all the worst. On the morning of Tisha B'Av, this coming Tuesday, we recite Kinnot, a larger number of these intricate, poignant poems. And the first one that we read on Tisha B'Av morning was written by the great poet, Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. He lived about 1,500 years ago. Shavas, our joy ceased. Suru meni shimuni ochrai, our detractors said, get away from me. Silchi umaos hesimuni be'edrei chaverai, they called me dirty and repulsive, worse than all my peers. Listen, please, to the words of the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik. The Churban, the destruction of the temple, almost 2,000 years ago at the hands of the Romans, the Churban was unexpected. The first word in the first Kinnot we recite on Tisha B'Av is shavas, which means to cease, to stop. Our joy ceased. But it has an additional connotation. It means that suddenly something important changed, something tragic happened. Shavas, all at once. Our sages tell us, this is a remarkable passage in the Talmud, our sages tell us that there was a city named Tur Malka. And the Talmud tells us that half of the inhabitants of Tur Malka were celebrating, while the other half was being destroyed. One side of the city did not know what was happening to the other side. And while the most terrible destruction was going on, just a short distance away, people were oblivious and celebrating. On October 7th, people in Israel, Jews all over the world, were celebrating. It was Shmini HaAtzeres, the 8th day of Sukkot. It was Simchas Torah in Israel. It was Shabbos. In those early hours, a few people knew a little bit, but most of the Jewish world was celebrating while the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust was unfolding. They called me dirty and repulsive. The irony that the non-Jews of the world hated us more when we were attacked. Listen, please, again to the words of the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik. What we learn from this is that our imagining of the Churban, of the destruction, must go beyond the physical destruction. It was that, of course. The Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, was physically destroyed. But Churban, destruction, also means something else. People have contempt for us. They treat us as if we were something dirty and unpleasant, something with which none of them want any contact. And we see this so clearly today in the global rise in anti-Semitism, support for Hamas, minimizing or disbelieving the clear pain and suffering we are undergoing. Now listen please to this. The Rav wrote this several decades ago. But listen to what he writes. He writes, this applies even today to our present situation. He was talking about the 1970s, but just remember, we're in 2024. Just absorb how prescient these words are. This applies even today in our present situation. When I listen to Eicha being read, the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, I have the impression that the events it described have all been transferred from over 1900 years ago to now, that they are actually happening in the present. And of course they are. The contempt of the world's communities. Remember, he's writing in the 1970s, but just think about how applicable this is. The contempt of the world's communities and nationalities for the Jew is perhaps the most awesome aspect of the destruction and the exile. It is this contempt that is the source of the complete alienation and indifference, even hatred of the non-Jew toward the Jew. And this contemptuous attitude has not yet come to an end. They made me as filth and refuge. This Kinnot continues with these words. Lama ruach apenu letevach shamaru. Why did they lie in wait to slaughter the breath of our lives? Ra'isa ki kesanor orenu kamaru. You, God, saw that our skin was burning in an oven. Rei v'nachidei migoy amru zakenu bachura psula kavolnu. They said, let us exterminate them as a nation. Again, this is written in the 7th century. They said, let us exterminate them as a nation. Zakenu bachur ubsula kavolnu. Old and young girls were attacked. Ram habitna amcha kulanu. Zuchar Hashem mahoya lanu. God looked down from on high. We are your faithful people. And remember, God, what has happened to us. Rabbi David Stav writes, when we read these lines again from the 7th century, we recall the homes in Be'eri and near Oz and at the Nova Festival, young and old, men and women who were tied up, burnt alive. This year, these phrases echo with renewed resonance. You may know about this, but it's incredible. Just a few hours after the war broke out, the police and the IDF announced the opening of a forensic identification center for the dead. Teams of police officers, volunteers, IDF personnel, doctors, forensic technicians worked tirelessly for months until they identified all the victims. A bone, a tooth, a sliver of skull. They came in bags, endless bags, mixed with ash, coins, bullets, and shrapnel. Like imperfect tapestries, some held the remains of different people. The bags were numbered, cataloged, and scanned. DNA was extracted. The science was precise, but it was hard to know what happened, how they were killed. The head of the Police Investigation and Intelligence Division, his name is Yoav Talem. He spoke about these investigators, and he said, in my eyes, these investigators were the heroes of the hour to identify as accurately as possible and as quickly as possible in order to provide comfort to these families. It's not just to recognize, it's not just to be able to look this satanic evil in the eyes and continue the work. The police have a historic role. You, speaking to the investigators, the forensic investigators, you are the new witnesses. You have to tell the people of Israel, and you have to tell the entire world what was done here. What are the horrors, without minimizing and without trying to explain, because it is impossible to explain. Human language has not been able to find and invent words to describe the magnitude of the horror that was perpetrated on our people. V'konen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, composed a eulogy for Yoshiyahu. Yoshiyahu, Josiah, was a king. He was a righteous man. And one of the Kinnot is a eulogy at his death. So now we switch from the macro vision of what happened to the Jewish people over all of time. And we now focus on Tisha B'Av mourning on one single individual. Eicha Eli konana me'elav ben shmona shana heichel lidrish me'elav. What a wail and a lament issued forth from the mighty leaders for Yoshiyahu, who at the age of 8 began to search for God on his own. V'lo huzkarlo shigui mifalav. The merit of his many deeds was to no avail when he was murdered. This is such an important lesson for us. No matter how many victims there are, we must remember each individual. Each person is an olam male, a complete world in and of him or herself. And this Jewish concern is evident in the tremendous efforts and identity to locate each person, to identify the remains of each person. And of course, our overriding concern for every single hostage to bring them home. I want to share with you a remarkable story. This is a story that is told by the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, and this is a story that he told in 1974, so keep the dates in mind. In 1974, Rav Soloveitchik told the following story. Nicolae Ceausescu, he was the communist dictator of Romania at that time. Ceausescu visited Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, 2 weeks before the famous Yom Kippur War, 1973, almost 51 years ago. So Ceausescu visited Sadat in Egypt 2 weeks before the war started. And they discussed the matter of the war. Everybody knew about it. So Ceausescu, this Romanian dictator, warned Sadat not to start the war, for you know the Jewish army is superior. Sadat admitted it, that militarily it is a lost cause. But he said there's another reason for starting the war. Sadat pulled open a drawer and took a clipping from a newspaper and handed it to Ceausescu. Ceausescu took the piece of paper, and the script was unreadable to him. It wasn't even Latin letters. And so Sadat said to him, "What do you see there on this paper?" Ceausescu said, "I can't read it. I don't know the language. It might as well be Chinese. I have no idea what I'm looking at. Why are you showing this to me?" Sadat said, take a look at the photo. What is it? It's a young boy, a young Israeli boy in uniform. What are you showing me? Sadat said, you know who this young man was? He was a soldier, an Israeli soldier. He was killed in the front along the Suez Canal. The Jewish people mourned for him. His picture is on the front page of the paper. Listen carefully. Such a people cannot live long in a war of attrition. If every individual is dear to them and they grieve and mourn for every individual, they will have to lose the war, no matter how wonderful their weapons are. The fear, says the Rav, the fear that young men should not die, the eagerness to protect a life, to save a young boy, overrides every fear and every logical consideration. And the Rav said, this is exactly what I told you. In Jewish values, if one dies, the world died. The world collapsed. And he said, this is a true story. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived in the 11th century in Spain. He lived his whole life dreaming to move to Israel, and he finally did. But his writing is filled with a yearning for Israel, a desire to be in Israel, the beauty of Israel. And on Tisha B'Av morning, we recite several of his Kinnot, several of his poems. Zion, halosishali lishlom asirayach, Zion. You're asking where your captives are. Darshe shlomech vehem yeser adoroyach. The remnant of your flock, where are they? And like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, we feel the tears in our eyes. At this moment, there are over 120 hostages still imprisoned by Hamas in Gaza. And the reality of these hostages, these captives, is our daily reality. And so this Kinnot, which was written almost 1,000 years ago, echoes with particular volume right now. And with it our prayers for a return of the hostages and the return of all of the evacuees to their homes. I've shared with you before a number of times quotes from Rachel Goldberg. Rachel Goldberg and John Polin are the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Polin. He was kidnapped from the Nova Festival on October 7th. He was grievously injured. I've shared with you a number of times Rachel speaking on the world stage on behalf of her son and all of the hostages. She wrote, every morning I get up and I put on this costume of a person, and I pretend to be human, because if I do what I feel like doing, which is lying on the floor and weeping, I can't save my only son, and I can't save anyone. In Gaza right now, this morning, we have grandfathers, brothers, sisters, fathers, spouses, sons, and daughters. Remember, there are still 19 young women in Gaza. We need to save our people. Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg lived in the 13th century. He wrote one of the Kinnots that we recite on Tisha B'Av morning. And it begins with the words, Sha'ali srufa be'esh, saved from the fire. It is a poem about an incident that happened in the year 1242 in Paris, where a gigantic number of volumes of the Talmud was gathered in the square and burned. And when Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg writes this Kinnot, remember this is before the printing press. Every single book, every single volume of Talmud had to be handwritten. This was a tremendous catastrophe. Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg expresses the concern and the fear that the Torah could be forgotten because there may be no books left from which to study. So listen please to this story. Ariel Zohar was 12 years old. He lived in Nir Oz, near Gaza. He is the only surviving member of his family. He went out for a run that morning, a run that saved his life. His mother, his father, his two sisters were murdered by the Hamas terrorists. Ariel's bar mitzvah was 3 weeks after October 7th. Several days after the massacre, Ariel had one request from a Zaka volunteer that came to visit. He came to visit him in his grandparents' home. And he asked this volunteer if they would go back to his home in Nir Oz and rescue his father's tefillin. Now, Ariel had been given a new pair of tefillin in honor of his bar mitzvah that he would start wearing on his bar mitzvah. But his father's tefillin were very special because his father's tefillin had been given to him by his grandfather, who had survived the Holocaust as the sole member of his family. The problem was that 10 days after October 7th, Nir Oz was still under regular rocket fire from Gaza. It was a closed military zone. Notwithstanding this, a Zaka volunteer, his name is Chaim Otmazgin. Chaim Otmazgin. He was able to be escorted by special forces, and he was given 4 minutes to search the home and to find the tefillin. He went inside the home, completely destroyed. He found the tefillin, the tefillin bag was burned, but he found the tefillin, and he brought them to Ariel and his 90-year-old Holocaust survivor grandfather. The grandfather said, "When I was 14, my parents were murdered. I survived, and today I have a grandson. They have done this to you," he said to his grandson Ariel. "They have done this to you at the age of 12. You will also survive and have grandchildren in the land of Israel." The one who did this, Chaim Otmazgin, said, "In the previous 10 days, I've been involved with identification of corpses, terrible, horrible, horrible things. But this was the first time I'd been brought to tears because a child who wants his father's tefillin represents continuity and a tradition that cannot be broken." This is just a small amount of what is becoming the voluminous material of how applicable each of these words that we have been saying for centuries on Tisha B'Av, how they tragically come to life today. But I also told you that there is new material that is being read, that is being written. I shared this with some of you last Friday in the email that we sent out. It's really incredible. If you have a chance to look at that email from ADATH on Friday, I shared a link to a video of Yagel Harush. Yagel Harush wrote and performed Kinnot Be'eri, the lamentation for Be'eri. Be'eri, of course, is one of the areas near Gaza that was most devastated on October 7th. And so he wrote this Kinnah, this lamentation, just now. Now the word Be'eri, the root of it is Be'er, which means a well of water. Be'er is a symbol of the way in which God gives life to the world through the living waters that flow from the well. Listen to just a few words of Kinas Be'eri. Eicha Be'eri hafcha lekivri, v'yom ma'ori hafach shchori. How did Be'eri turn into my tomb, the day of my light to the day of my gloom? V'hushchas kol pri v'nepach shiri, eini nova mayim me'omek shivri. Its songs silenced, trampled fruit and leaf. My eyes well from tears, from the depth of my grief. Eicha imahos vilados and na'aros bishvi meluchos kivime paros. How could mothers and daughters torn from their home be led away, blood-soaked, like the days of a pogrom? My eyes well with tears from the depth of my hurt. God, in your great mercy, please heal our pain, heal our hearts, dispel our fears. Ve'eni novas tashke be'eri. And let us water be'eri from the well of our tears. Nurit Hirschfeld-Skupinski is a survivor of the massacre in Nachal Oz, near Be'eri. And she wrote a Kinnah. Remember that the book of Eicha that we read on Monday night begins with the words Eicha Yashva Badad. How she sits alone, referring to Jerusalem, the Jewish people sitting alone in mourning. Oh, how she sat alone near Oz, full of blood. Sderot was like a widow, a city stunned, and who is faithful to her? In the shelter room, one family and another one. The many-eyed women at the observation posts, and there was no listening, and deliverance none. Captive women and captive men are sitting there still. 120 men, women, elders, and children, crying. They are crying in the night, tears on their cheeks, and there is no one who comforts. Rabbi Yosef Rimon, the amazing, incredible person I've quoted to you so many times before, he wrote Tefillah la'akdos ha'umah, a prayer for the unity of the Jewish people. Mishaberach avaseinu Avram Yitzchak v'Yakov, hu yivarach v'yishmar kol echad v'achas miYisrael. May he who blessed our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless and protect everyone within the community of Israel, and may God instill within our hearts to look favorably upon all. And may we merit to be endowed with goodness in all ways. May he implant unity and love within our midst. And we should speedily see the coming of the righteous Mashiach, the son of David. And please say Amen. Finally, this story. My friend, my colleague, Rabbi Reuven Trodbergs. his niece, his sister's daughter, was killed on October 7th. We were standing at the grave waiting for the burial of my niece, Adi Vital Kaplun, murdered in her home in Kibbutz Cholit on October 7th, protecting her 2 young children who survived. My sister, Jackie Vital, and her husband, Yaron, stood with me beside the open grave, gazing out at the crowd of well over 1,000. There was a pause for a few moments as the family gathered in the spot where they would stand. In that silence, Jackie leaned over to me and she said, if I could, I would sing Hatikva right now. Reuven said, I had no response. One of so many moments struck dumb in those weeks. Hatikva? With your dear, sweet daughter murdered for being a Jew in our Jewish state? You, who could have raised your family in the tranquility of Canada? Now, as we are burying Adi? After the Shiva, he says, we gathered again at the same spot. It's a custom that many people have, that when the Shiva ends, to visit the grave. This was casual. Not 1,000 people, but a few dozen. Friends, family. Psalms were said, informal words of tribute, people lovingly sharing. Discomfort, pain, standing beside the fresh grave of a murdered young mother, friend, daughter, sister, murdered in her home. Jackie stepped forward and she said, I wanted to do this at the funeral, but we didn't. I made Aliyah from Canada, and I would do it again. So now, I would like all of us to sing Hatikva. The private pain, holding hands with pride of being a part of the miraculous homeland of our people. Private pain, public pride, privately shattered, but gazing from a distance, seeing our state, our privilege, and expressing hope, Hatikva, mourning and comfort intertwined. Kol od belevav penima Nefesh Yehudi Homia Ulafate Mizrach Kadima Ayin Letzion Sophia Od lavda tikvatenu Tikva bat shnot alpayim liotam chavshi be'artzenu eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim liotam chavshi be'artzenu eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. Hashem owes la'amo yitain. God, give your people strength. Hashem yivarech esamo b'shalom. God, bless your people with peace. My friends, I wish you a meaningful period of time expressing the sadness and the grief, but also remembering Hatikva, the hope, the comfort, the redemption.